I look at my hands now, spotted with age and shaking with a tremor that has nothing to do with the cold, and I wonder if the dirt ever really came out. In the deep creases of my palms, under the fingernails, there is a shadow. It is not the rich, dark loam of the Mugello Valley. It is not the soil that smells of sun-baked rosemary and crushed olives. It is gray clay. It is the color of a bruise. It is the mud of the winter line, and 50 years later, I can still feel its weight. They say memory is a library, orderly and categorized, but mine is a collapsed tunnel. I am not sure if it was October or November. I am not even sure of the faces anymore. There was a boy next to me, huddled in the shallow scrape of earth we called a trench. I want to call him Mario, but perhaps Mario was the one who died in Sicily. Let us call him the cough. That is what I remember most. A wet, tearing sound that rattled in his chest every 30 seconds, a metronome counting down the moments until the next shell. He tried to stifle it in a wool scarf that smelled of wet dog and rancid fat, but the sound escaped, echoing in the unnatural silence of the ravine. I sat with my knees pulled to my chest, my hands caked in that hateful, freezing slime. In Tuscany, before the world went mad, I was a man of the earth. I knew the soil like I knew the shape of my wife's hip. You could pick up a handful of the dirt on my father's farm and squeeze it. If it held together, it was ready for the seed. If it crumbled, it was thirsty. The earth was a partner. It was alive. It gave back what you put into it. But here, south of Rome, the earth was an enemy. It was dead weight, heavy with water and the rot of unburied things. It did not want to grow wheat. It wanted to swallow men. A low vibration started in the ground, traveling up through the soles of my boots before the sound even reached my ears. The artillery was waking up. It was miles away, perhaps the British guns, perhaps the Americans, but the mountains carried the tremor like a bell. Dust, fine and chalky, sifted down from the lip of our hole, coating my eyelashes. I closed my eyes and stopped breathing. This was the terror. Not the shrapnel, not the burning lead, but the weight. The idea of the trench walls folding in. To be planted like a seed in this godforsaken clay, alive, pressing against the dark, screaming into a mouth full of dirt until the air ran out. I was a farmer. I knew what happened to things buried in the ground. They dissolved. They became nothing. I looked at my uniform, the gray-green wool of the Italian army, but with the insignia of the Republic, the RSI. We were Mussolini's last gamble, but we were owned by the Germans. I was 25 years old, and I was not a soldier. I was a man who knew how to prune a grapevine so the sun hit the center of the cluster. I knew how to fix a tractor engine with a piece of wire and a prayer. I did not belong here, shivering under the glare of a foreign master, waiting to die for a cause that had already lost. The cough racked the boy next to me again, louder this time. I glared at him. Silence was our only armor. Above us, the sky was the color of a dirty sheet. The wind whipped through the shattered skeletons of chestnut trees, making a sound like a mournful flute. Then came the boots, heavy, rhythmic, crunching on the gravel. A shadow fell over our hole. It was the Feldwebel. I never knew his name, only the sharp angles of his face and the way his eyes looked through us as if we were livestock. He barked something in German, a guttural string of sounds that felt like stones hitting tin. He pointed a gloved hand toward the ridge that loomed above us, a jagged spine of rock and mud that overlooked the valley floor. I didn't need to speak his language to understand the order. We were sappers. We were the mules. We were to go up to that exposed, wind-flayed ridge and dig. We were to carve new veins into the mountain for the machine guns that would slaughter the advancing Allies. I looked up at the ridge. It was a mess of craters and unstable scree. The geology was all wrong for digging. I could see it from here. The slope was too steep, the soil too loose. To disturb it was to invite a landslide. My stomach turned over, a cold knot of dread tightening under my ribs. To dig there was suicide. It was digging one's own grave while standing in it. The Feldwebel shouted again, his hand dropping to the holster at his belt. The threat was clear. The cough scrambled up, grabbing his rifle, his eyes wide and watery. I stayed seated for a second longer, my hands pressing into the freezing mud, trying to find some anchor. Some reason to refuse. But there was no refusal in this world. There was only the gun in front of you and the gun behind you. I picked up my shovel. It was a short-handled infantry tool, the blade sharpened to a dull edge. It felt heavy, heavier than a plowshare. I stood up, the joints of my knees popping, and climbed out of the relative safety of the hole. The wind hit me instantly, biting through the thin wool of my tunic. I looked at the ridge, my personal Golgotha, and took the first step toward the slope that promised to bury me. The climb was a slow, breathless scramble. We moved in a ragged line, the Italian conscripts mixed with a few grim-faced German pioneers. The air grew thinner, sharper, smelling of sulfur and the metallic tang of snow that hadn't fallen yet. As we crested the lower rise and moved onto the ridge proper, something shifted in my mind. The soldier receded, and the farmer stepped forward. This is what they call the 1,000-yard stare, but for me, it was the opposite. I stopped looking at the horizon and started looking at the ground. My eyes read the terrain not for cover, but for composition. I saw where the water runoff had cut deep channels, exposing the yellow subsoil. I saw patches of weeds that grew only where the earth had been recently turned. A farmer knows when a field has been worked, and this ridge had been worked. The soil here was tortured. It wasn't just the shell craters. It was the unnatural mounds, the subtle depressions. The unit before us, God rest their souls, whoever they were, had tried to fortify this position. I could see the scars of their failure. We passed a foxhole that had collapsed in on itself. The timber supports snapped like dry twigs. Then we saw them, or what was left of them. We came into a small depression, a natural bowl in the ridge line. Scattered across the ground were the remnants of a mortar team. Twisted tubes of metal, crates splintered into matchsticks. And the men, they were not bodies anymore. They were part of the landscape, a boot sticking out of a drift of shale, a gray tunic shredded and matted into the mud. They hadn't been buried. The earth had simply risen up and claimed them during the last barrage. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. This was the harvest here. In Mugello, we harvested wheat. Here, the ground harvested us. The cough, the boy stopped beside me. He didn't cough this time. He gagged. The smell was faint in the cold air, but distinct. Sweet cloying, unmistakable. I looked at the slope above the wreckage. It was waiting for us. The angle of repose was critical. If we dug in the wrong place, the vibration of our own tools would bring the mountain down. I felt a strange, detached clarity. The German orders were to dig trenches along the crest. My farmer's instinct screamed that the crest was unstable. We needed to dig on the reverse slope, where the roots of the scrub oaks held the soil together. I tried to signal to the Feldwebel, pointing at the ground, then at the trees. He ignored me, waving us forward with a frantic motion of his arm. He wanted the guns on the high ground. He didn't care if the ground could hold them. We spread out. I found a spot near a jagged rock formation, hoping the stone would offer some stability. I drove the blade of my shovel into the earth. It wasn't like plowing. Plowing is an act of hope. You open the earth to let the air in, to make a cradle for life. This was an act of violence. I was wounding the ground, hacking at it, forcing it to yield shelter. The first few inches were frozen hard. Then the soil turned to a thick, sucking paste. I worked with a desperate rhythm. My shoulders burned. My breath plumed in the air. Around me, the other men were doing the same. A chorus of steel biting into dirt. Then the world ended. It didn't start with a sound. It started with a pressure change. A sudden vacuum that sucked the air out of my lungs. Then the sky turned white. The noise followed a split second later, a roar so loud it wasn't heard but felt. It was a physical blow, a hammer striking the base of my skull. Allied artillery. They had seen us, or they had the ridge zeroed in. It didn't matter. I threw myself flat into the shallow depression I had carved. The earth leapt beneath me. It bucked like a terrified horse. Clods of frozen mud, rocks, and hot metal rained down, drumming against my helmet. The smell of cordite was suffocating, burning the inside of my nose. Another shell landed closer. The ground didn't just shake, it liquefied. I felt the wall of my trench shudder. To my right, through the smoke and the flying debris, I saw the cough. He was screaming, but I couldn't hear him. I could only see his mouth open, a black void in a pale face. He had dug too deep into the soft shale. A shell impacted the slope above him. It wasn't a direct hit, but the shockwave was enough. The hillside groaned, a deep, tectonic grinding sound that cut through the explosions. The earth above the boy gave way. It didn't fall like rocks. It poured like water. A wave of heavy gray slurry cascaded down, burying his legs, then his waist, then his chest. He clawed at the air, his eyes locking onto mine. My fear, my nightmare. I didn't think. The soldier in me vanished. The farmer remained. When a calf is stuck in a bog, you don't wait. You move. I scrambled out of my hole, crawling on my belly through the mud, while the air above me shredded with shrapnel. I reached him. He was buried up to his neck now, the weight of the landslide crushing the air out of him. His face was turning purple. I grabbed my shovel. I didn't stand up. I stayed low, hacking at the mud around him. I had to clear the weight before he suffocated. I dug frantically, throwing the dirt behind me. The artillery was walking away from us now, the explosions marching down the line. But I didn't pause. I freed his arms. He gasped, sucking in air, coughing up grit. I kept digging, trying to free his chest. The soil was dense, packed tight by the impact. I drove the shovel down hard, aiming to lever a heavy clod of clay away from his ribs. The blade sliced through the mud. It didn't hit rock. It didn't hit roots. It struck something metallic, a dull, hollow that vibrated up the handle and into my bones. I froze. The battlefield seemed to fall silent, though I knew the guns were still firing. Beneath the blade of my shovel, under the layer of mud I had just disturbed, there was a sound. Not an explosion. Not yet. It was a mechanical engagement. A spring uncoiling. A pin sliding home. The sound was small, precise, and terrifyingly final. I looked at the boy. He stopped struggling. We both looked down at the shovel blade, buried in the earth between us. I knew, with the intuition of a man who has walked 1,000 fields, that I had just found what the previous unit had left behind. And I knew that if I moved the shovel, if I breathed, if I even trembled, the earth would finish what it started. My blood turned to ice. The boy under the mud saw it in my face. He stopped thrashing. We became statues in the middle of hell, slowly, with the delicacy of a man brushing pollen from a bloom. I moved my hand. I needed to see the enemy. I scraped the heavy clay away from the shovel blade. The gray metal casing of a German Teller mine emerged from the slurry, its pressure plate depressed by the weight of the earth and my tool. It was armed. It was waiting, but it was not sitting level. The mine was perched on something solid, something that had stopped my shovel from penetrating deeper. I cleared more dirt, my fingernails tearing against the grit. The boy whimpered a high, thin sound, but I hissed at him to silence. Beneath the ugly industrial steel of the mine, a face looked up at me. It was terracotta, smooth and ancient, emerging from the dark soil like a ghost. An Etruscan smile. I was kneeling on a grave 3,000 years old, and the war had placed a bomb right on the ancestor's chest. The irony tasted like copper in my mouth. To save this boy, to save myself, I had to defuse a modern death resting on an ancient one. If I failed, we would all become dust. The new bones mixed with the old. I had no kit, no wrenches, no safety pins. I only had the bayonet at my hip and the calluses on my hands. I drew the knife. The steel slid against leather, a whisper that sounded like a scream. I leaned in. The air smelled of cordite and wet rot. My world narrowed down to the gap between the mine's fuse well and the terracotta lid. I needed a wedge. I saw a fractured piece of pottery lying in the mud, a shard of the tomb I had just desecrated. I picked it up, a piece of the past to stop the present. I slid the bayonet tip into the fuse mechanism, probing for the striker spring. The mud made everything slick. One slip, One tremor of my hand, and the harvest would be over for us all. I could feel the tension of the spring through the knife, a coiled viper waiting to strike. I jammed the pottery shard into the gap, wedging the firing pin back. Sweat stung my eyes, blinding me, but I did not blink. I was a farmer performing surgery on the earth itself. I took the weight of the shovel in my left hand, and with my right, I prepared to twist the detonator free. The metal groaned. It was a sound of protest, of rusted threads fighting the turn. I held my breath until my lungs burned. I twisted. The fuse assembly gave way. The spring tension released with a dull, internal thud that vibrated through my fingertips. The viper was dead. I fell back against the trench wall, the air rushing into my chest in great heaving gasps. The boy scrambled out of the hole, weeping, clawing his way up the ridge away from the tomb. I stayed. I sat there in the mud, staring at the disarmed mine lying impotent on the smiling face of the sarcophagus. I reached out and touched the terracotta. It was cold. We covered it back up. We buried the ancestor again, hiding him from the mortars and the boots. That was a lifetime ago. The winter line broke. The Republic fell. I went back to the Mugello Valley when the guns finally stopped. I returned to the plow. I returned to the seasons. But the land was different. The soil was no longer just the giver of life. It was the keeper of secrets. I sit here now on my porch, watching the sun blade into the vineyards, and I hold a piece of jagged terracotta in my hand. I stole it that day, a reminder. People look at these hills and see beauty. They see the olives and the wheat. I see the ridges where we broke our fingernails. I see the mounds that are not natural. I see the geology of bones. I tried to be a farmer again. I tried to sow the seeds in the spring and reap in the autumn. But every time the plow blade hits a stone, my heart stops. Every time I dig a post hole, I wait for the click. The machine is broken forever. The harvest is ruined, because I know that beneath the roots and the worms, the earth is holding its breath. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.